Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I want you to think about a city that you'd really like to live in. So right now, you know when you have a chat with your missus or you have a chat with your parents about a nice city where you'd like to go and live, or maybe work or retire in, what kind of cities come to mind in the world right now? Any ideas? Any shout outs? Favorite cities to work and live or where people like to settle these days? London, right? We're living in one for all its sins. Any others? Any other ideas? Dubai, yeah, definitely. Dubai is another favorite. Abu Dhabi, mashallah. Okay. Istanbul, massive favorite, where I went for my honeymoon. Any other takers? What about across the pond? Any big cities? So what was that? The Atlantic. The big pond. Big cities in the USA? New York, Washington DC, San Francisco, Chicago. We've watched so many films about all of these cities. There's been so many books and stories written about these cities. And the interesting thing about these cities, what is it about these cities that make people want to go there, that make them successful? It's that they have this massive amount of people there, for a start, a whole load of talent, a whole load of technology, a whole load of innovation. They've got jobs there, they've got prosperity. A place like London is always described as a melting pot. People come here from all corners of the world, from the good and the great to people who are just trying to be chancers. You've got the story of Dick Whittington who came to London, and many people are like that even to this day. And you've got a whole load of business that is situated in London. This is the place to be, right? People want to learn English so they can work in places like London and the West. And if we could move on to the first slide. Baghdad, in the golden age of the Islamic civilization, from around the 8th century to the 14th century, was that kind of place. Baghdad was a place that people would come from all over the world to settle in. At its peak, it had about 2 million people living there. And that's a crazy statistic. When you contextualize it with the population of the world at the time, any ideas what would the population of the world at the time have been in the 8th century, 9th century? It's about 7 billion right now. What would it have been back in those days? Have a guess. What's that? 3 billion? 100 billion. That's much closer. So it was about 200 to 250 million was the entire population of the entire globe, and Baghdad had near enough a percent of that entire globe living there. That's how important it was. These days we've got 7 billion people, and London has about 7 or 8 million people living there. So as a proportion, it's tiny compared to Baghdad. So you can see the significance of a place like Baghdad at the time. And Baghdad had something called the House of Wisdom, Bayt al-Hikmah, at the heart of it, which was fascinatingly headed up by a Christian scholar who was a translator, and he was a physicist, and he was a medic as well. And Hunayn ibn Ishaq, the thing that I find fascinating about him is that Muslims were that confident at the time, they were that at ease with how ahead they were in the world, that they were happy to put a Christian at the head of such an important academic institution. They were willing to do that, they were comfortable. Just like these days, in the most advanced and prosperous countries, they welcome migrants from all over the world and they assimilate them really quickly. And then those migrants feel a sense of belonging to that country really quickly. Because when a country is successful, that becomes a lot easier to do. And the Christian Hunayn ibn Ishaq was the head of Bayt al-Hikmah. If we move on. And then if we move on again, yeah, there we go, actually go back one. So what was it about the Islamic civilization at the time that made them so successful? So I've kind of categorized it into 3 different sections. And by the way, what we're going to be doing in this entire talk is firstly, we're going to be looking at where we were, where we are now, and what can we do to get back to where we were many, many years ago, and practically how we go about doing that. And so the 3 things that I've pinpointed are economics, politics, and culture. So economically, Muslims were incredibly prosperous. They were the people who were leading the technological wave at the time. And at each point, at each inflection point of technology that we've seen in human history, we see big winners come and emerge from nothing. So the Muslim civilization, the Islamic civilization, the key thing that they really benefited from was the invention of, believe it or not, that stuff that sat in the cupboard over there, pieces of paper, books. So for the first time in history, Muslims, they learned how to make paper, and then they built upon that, and they could make paper really quickly, and they could make it into books. And for the first time, people were making a living out of buying and selling books. And that sounds like a really, banal, mundane thing, but actually it's really important. Because if you think about it, the amount you can quickly tell someone by giving them a book is a lot. And if you can give that person, someone has learned a whole lot of stuff, and then he condenses it down into a book, and you've got 6 or 7 people who do that, and then you just sit down and read those 6 or 7 books in a week or 2, suddenly you're standing on the shoulders of giants. So the data that could be proliferated at the time became vast. And so Muslims started streaking ahead, way ahead of other civilizations because of this. And they were very forward-looking. Like there was obviously, as many of you will know, Muslims were the leaders in science, in physics, in biology, in chemistry, you name it. We were the people who were pushing the boundaries. We were the people who all of the other scholars from all over the world would want to come to settle, because they knew that that was a place where you would benefit most. And I've been privileged to have a good education, and you think about the same thing when you go to university, where you want to go to the best university, not just because it has great resources, or that it's got nice looking buildings, but also because of the kind of people that it brings together. And Muslims had that at the time. And then politically, of course, Muslims were incredibly powerful. They were the biggest empire at the time, and an incredibly powerful empire as well. And then culturally, this is really important. Like if you think about the way that we think as human beings, we learn how to think, we learn how to interact with each other, we learn language through the medium of culture, through the medium of interaction with other people, through Teletubbies, through Power Rangers, through Biff and Chip and Kipper. That's how we learn how to speak. That's how we learn how to read. That's how we learn how to communicate. And actually, if I maybe have a show of hands, who has read one of the books of Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling? Okay, what about Anthony Horowitz, Alex Rider, the Alex Rider series? What about, and this is brownie points because it's a bit more highbrow, Charles Dickens or something like that. Allahu Akbar, there's quite a few there. What about, I don't know who else, Stephen King, quite a popular author. So that's interesting, isn't it? Those are the people who we rely on to learn how we think. Because a baby, when he learns that fire is hot, it's a cause and effect story that he tells himself. The baby goes to the fire, it's hot, he touches it, he won't ever do that again. And that's a story that he's learnt. And when we think about ourselves, we tell ourselves stories about cause and effect. If I do this, then this will happen. If I do that, then that will happen. If I buy a car, then I will be able to get from A to B. And we think in cause and effect. That's how we think as human beings. So who is teaching us stories? The people teaching us stories are J.K. Rowling, Stephen King, Anthony Horowitz, R.L. Stein, Mallory Blackman, Charles Dickens. Those are the people who have our intellectual bandwidth. That's where we've learned our narratives from. That's where we learned our ethics from, and that's where we learn our language from. Like the very thing, the very words by which we think in our heads, we are learning from people with a different culture, often to ourselves. And at the time, instead, when the Muslims were at their peak, Arabic was the lingua franca. Arabic was a language of technology. Arabic was a language like the equivalent of English today. And people would read, the Quran, even if they weren't Muslim. People would read, the key Islamic books or the key texts, Alf Layla wa Layla, 1001 Arabian Nights. They would read those texts, and that's where they would go back to, and that's where they would think, they would get their thinking and their language and their understanding. So culture is hugely important, and Muslims had it back in the day. So if we move on now to where Muslims are now, it's a bit tragic. So Muslims globally are 20% poorer than the rest of the world. So we did some number crunching and looked at gross national income statistics, and we compared it between Muslim countries and non-Muslim countries. We're 20% poorer than the rest of the world. And in the UK specifically, 46% of the Muslim community live in the 10% poorest constituencies. So if you go to one of the 10% poorest constituencies, you will find a high proportion of Muslims living there. And look, we don't have to look very far. All my life I've lived in Muslim areas. So from the northeast, key areas where there's Muslim community, or Leicester, or now East London, these are the poorer boroughs of London. And Muslims are predominant amongst that. So economically, we are suffering. In terms of Muslim companies, in the top 100 companies, now Muslims make up about 20-25% of the world's population. So out of the top 100 companies, logically, what would you expect? How many companies should we have? About 20-25, right? Instead, we have zero. We have zero companies. Have a guess where the first Muslim company appears on the list. 100 and something. Have a guess.
120.
That's not a bad shout, actually. 122. And it's none other than Syndicate, the Saudi company. And I feel like that's almost cheating, because Syndicate is, a very powerful company because of natural resources in Saudi Arabia. So we've not necessarily earned that. We've not done an IBM or a Microsoft, or we've come up with something new. We have literally drilled into the ground and got the oil out. So that's quite alarming if you think about it. The top 100 companies in the world, none of them are Muslim. None of them have Muslim founders. None of them have links to Muslims at all. Now, if we move on to Nobel Peace Prizes or Nobel Prizes for other things, Muslims have in total received 12 prizes, of which 7 are peace prizes. So I'm not saying that peace prizes are worth less, but they're not prizes that you would get for being incredible at physics or having made a breakthrough in DNA or gene technology. So 12 prizes that we've won. And for context, there's approximately 950 prizes that have been given over the last century. And again, for context, because we should learn from other communities, the Jewish community has had 180 prizes. So about 20% of all of the Nobel Prizes have gone to the Jewish community. And they're obviously our religious brethren. So we should take inspiration from that. And then finally, I keep banging on about culture. Of the top 100 films in the last, in the last decade, I think it was, Muslims have had 2 films. We've had, and there were 2 Persian films, because the Persians have relatively decent, relatively decent film. But these days, we think in film, right? Hands up, who watched what's it called? The Dark Knight. And I know some people have watched it, but I don't see the hands. So everyone's watched The Dark Knight. Everyone's watched Avatar. Everyone's watched, Superman. You've probably watched like Gladiator. This is the stuff that is, in our hearts and minds these days. And, can anyone name me a prominent, Middle Eastern film or a prominent Pakistani film over the last decade?
I watch Prince of Persia.
All right, fair enough. I think that's actually made in Hollywood though. But anyway, khair. So, you can see the stark contrast, and that's a big problem. So as a Muslim community, we are, not necessarily doing particularly well. So, what do we do about that? And, where do we go from there? And I think the key kind of, before we dive into that question and think about, how we can answer that, the key kind of metrics I think we should think about is we want to be going from a community of net importers to a community of exporters. What do I mean by that? What I mean is we want to be a community that rather than just consuming and buying what others have come up with, we should be creative and coming up with stuff that others can benefit from. So we should be like, if we use the example of economies like China, massive exporting economy. We should be people like Germany. All of us probably drive German cars these days, or Japanese cars. We should be like those kind of people that are exporting as opposed to importing. Now, in terms of giving ourselves a bit of a game plan, because obviously we're in a bit of a pickle, right? If Muslims are 20% poorer than the rest of the world, then we need to work out a way of, in order to get back to parity, we need to work out a way of not just growing, but growing faster than the rest of the world in order to get back to parity. So how do we do that? There are actually a few great examples, and I've picked out 4 examples that we can look to in history, recent history as well, of countries that have gone from completely devastated in many instances to really, really successful and prosperous countries. And we can learn from them because they had that really accelerated growth that we would now want to look to achieve as members of the Muslim community. So the first of these is South Korea. So if we move on to South Korea, you'll see that there are consistent themes in each of these 4 countries. The South Koreans, after the Korean War, were devastated. They had lost a whole load of people, of course. Families were disrupted, industry had been destroyed, and now the South Koreans, they had basically started at the same point as North Korea. And you can see in the graph at the bottom, the red line is North Korea, and the South Koreans were roughly there or thereabouts. And obviously North Korea, as we now know, is really backwards. So you can imagine the situation that the South Koreans were in at the time. They did a few key things, absolutely essential things. The first thing they did was they really emphasized research and development and technology, and focusing on where the next big trends were coming from. And the government in particular, they really supported, microchip technology, just because they could see that computers were going to become really important. And South Korea, they actually spend more on R&D per capita as a portion of their GDP than even countries like the USA or Japan and other countries. So they are massive in how much they focus on R&D. And within 50 or 60 years, I mean, you can see that graph. It's a crazy graph. It just goes straight up. And as a result of that hard work, and as a result of, also importantly, culture. So one of the key things they did, the leadership in South Korea, they said that you should all treat your employees as members of your family. We're all in this together. this is one big, mission that we're all on and we're all working on. And South Korean productivity mushroomed, and each of these countries then started having a middle class, people who were doing well because, obviously there was now wealth in the country, and so then they started spending, and then it was a nice virtuous cycle that started going. It was a nice flywheel effect that kept the economy boosted. And within 50 or so years, South Korea went from zero to each of us now. I mean, I'm using a Samsung phone, right? And I'm sure half of the population, I won't get into the Apple-Samsung debate, but half of the group here is probably using Samsung. Some of you might have driven here but using a Hyundai or a Kia car. You'll probably have some kind of microchip being used right now in some of the gadgets that you're carrying right now or at home that are South Korean in make. You probably have some kind of white good, fridge, freezer, dishwasher, washing machine that comes from South Korea. It's crazy. In 50 years, that's what these guys have achieved. And it shows the potential of what is possible. So if we carry on now to Silicon Valley. So hands up, who knows where Silicon Valley is? Whereabouts is it?
Isn't it in the US?
It is in the US, more specifically?
California.
California, right. And what's special about Silicon Valley?
It's like a tech hub or something. Yeah.
It's the place for tech. So it has per person wealth, it is only surpassed by one other place in the entire world, and that's Geneva in Switzerland, where all the the black money goes. So in terms of just clean money, in terms of just pure productivity, Silicon Valley is the place to be. And the crazy thing is that Silicon Valley, if you look at it, it has gone on an absolute mushroom, an absolute inflection curve over the last 2 decades, and the last 2-3 decades. If you look back in the 1990s, what were the big companies? The big companies were people like GM, Ford, IBM, Exxon, GE, General Electric. So they were big, hardware companies that made actual stuff like cars or engines or machinery, and they were, the old economy kind of businesses. And if you look at the top 10, there was a lot of banks in there as well. Now, if you look at the big companies in the US, you have people like Apple and Amazon and Berkshire Hathaway, which is a big investor in technology companies now. You've got Facebook, you've got Google, you've got Netflix. All of these companies have come about literally in the last 2 decades, and now they literally control so much of our airtime. Right? If you think about it, I've used Google at least a dozen times already today. I've probably used Amazon or got an Amazon purchase today. And some of us might go home and watch Netflix, or in my case, Amazon Prime. And so again, we're touch points in terms of where we're giving our time, where we're giving our data, and where we're giving our money. It's these companies, and they've come about in the last 20 years. Like in the 2000s, search wasn't really a thing. You remember Ask Jeeves and Yahoo and others, Alta Vista, that was then. And within the span of just a decade and a half, Google just owns that space. And it is the company in the world. And in fact, some of these companies have economies that are larger than the biggest countries combined. So the UK and the Germany combined are smaller than some of these largest companies when you look at how wealthy they are and their size as well. So crucial point is how quickly this happened. So what's the Silicon Valley success story? So there's a few things. There's a whole bunch of things actually, but the first thing is it has great talent. So when a company has gone from a small company to a massive company like Microsoft, for example, or Dell, or IBM, or Sun Microsystems, or other companies, what happens is that there is a vast number of people, thousands of people, who've been in that company at that time, who know how to go from level 2 to level 3, and level 3 to level 4. And when you have that ability to do that, then when Facebook or Google or whoever comes along, the next companies come along, they then are able to hire those people and learn how to do that. Suleiman's very interested in all this stuff. Suleiman, Mama. So the other crucial thing in all this is that Stanford University is at the heart of Silicon Valley. So there's a whole load of research and academia that goes into all this stuff. And actually, companies like Google came out of Stanford and research projects out of universities. And yet we don't like our kids to even think about doing PhDs because we'd rather get them straight into work. And yet, this is so important. Then another crucial ingredient to all of this is that there's a whole load of venture capital out there. There's a whole load of money that these companies are able to raise and try and make a go at it. And this is really important for us as a Muslim community, because as a community, we don't think in those kind of high risk, high reward ways. So what I mean by that is, if you're a rich Muslim, what kind of asset class would you mainly put your property? Would you mainly put your assets in? I've kind of given it away.
Real estate.
Exactly. Yeah. Go on. What were you going to say? Exactly. So you'd put it into property. But the problem with the property is that it's great. It'll get you from 0 to 5, and it's a good thing. But it's not going to change the world. I mean, I don't know the last property that changed the world. Whereas if you invest in the technologies of the future and you do it in a clever way where you're putting it into lots of potential, you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, you're trying to get multiple people to try and do stuff, then you will succeed overall. And what do I mean by that? So a really prominent recent failure was the founder of Twitch. Have you heard of Twitch? It's like a YouTube equivalent. It's like a gamer's online videoing thing, multi-billion company. So this guy, he then left Twitch and he founded this company that makes the legal work that it needs to be done much slicker. It's completely online. It's a lot cheaper to do, and they're trying to disrupt the legal sector. That recently collapsed. But guess how much money that company, just an idea and a good founder, how much money that company raised when they were just kicking off? Any ideas? 2,000, a lot more than that. We're in the millions. In the millions. What's that? 2 million? No, more than that.
10 million.
What's that?
10 million.
10 million. It was actually, did you say 50? It was actually $75 million. That's just chucked at basically an idea and a good team, obviously. But that's the kind of money that's been thrown at this stuff. And it was done because the same people that throw money at that stuff are also throwing money at, I don't know, Airbnb or Dropbox or GitHub or all these other companies, that Slack, that you and I both use day to day. And when that happens, then even if you just have one big hit, if you just have one company that hits it out the park, then you don't need to worry about the rest of your companies after that, because that one company has made you 500x, 1000x return. After that, it doesn't really make a difference, because you could chuck 50 million, 100 million here or there, and it doesn't make a difference. And that's genuinely what is happening these days in the venture capital world. And just for context, so my background, I mean, I quit my job as of last week and have gone full time on Islamic Finance Guru, because I feel that this is a really important mission, and we'll talk about what I do and how this all fits into all this. But what I used to work in as a corporate lawyer is in the private equity and venture capital space. So I saw firsthand the kind of money that was being put into venture capital and where that money was being put and what the 1% were investing in. So I worked on transactions where we saw where the likes of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation were putting their money, where Larry Page and others were putting their money, and that gives you a real understanding of where me as an individual I'm doing things very differently, and why that's so problematic. And then let's move on to Germany. So Germany, again, key things. Germany after World War II was completely razed to the ground, as we all know. And from there, it's built itself into an absolute powerhouse that we know of today. And the things that made it successful were great culture, really, really hardworking country, and also really focused on research. Again, it's really focused on research and technology. And we all drive German cars now. Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, and the list goes on. And then finally, Israel. So Israel was a relatively poor country when it was founded. And I'm not necessarily going to talk about the politics of what was founded and what happened. Obviously, as Muslims, we have very strong views on that. But Israel, was a very poor country when it started, and in a relatively short span of time, it has become one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So it's something that we can learn from. And the way they've done that is they have been open-minded and integrated into the global economy. So the flights from Tel Aviv to San Francisco, Silicon Valley, are some of the most popular and overbooked and highly frequented flights that you can get in the world in terms of just flight maps. And what the Israelis did was, again, they betted big on tech, they betted big on research and development, and they have, from a cultural perspective, it's really helpful for them to have the military. Everyone is conscripted to the military, and they have to do a year in the military. And obviously, we don't necessarily agree with a lot of things that the Israeli military does, but the one thing it does teach their soldiers is discipline. And the other thing it teaches is it gives exposure to a lot of technology and research and a lot of high-tech stuff. And by the way, this is from an interview that was given by a technology company founder who was ex-IDF. So this is what he was saying about how important the IDF is as a kind of belt, a kind of, I can't remember, think of the word, a kind of conveyor belt for producing new talent. And so the natural result of a person coming out of the IDF with great exposure to technology and great discipline is a lot of the time business, and a lot of the time in the technology sector. And because there's that conveyor belt, there's already great talent and great networks there already that can help you out quite easily. And so that's why we see a whole lot of companies, a whole lot of Israeli companies, technology companies that are doing fantastically well. So companies like Fiverr.com, or you might have companies like Monday.com. You might have seen some of their adverts. Or Curve, the Curve card is again an Israeli company. Suleiman, Mama, Joe. So, and then the final thing to say about Israel is it's incredibly hardworking as a culture. So a friend of mine, he's a technology company co-founder, Muslim guy, and he was talking to an Israeli investor, and he was asking him, what's your routine like? And he said, well, look, I wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning, I go for a 6-mile run, I have a shower, then I go to work, and then I work till late at night, and then I go to sleep, and then I repeat. And my friend was just shocked. He was like, you must be an anomaly in Israel. But he said, no, there's many people like me who do that, and it's a cultural thing. There's a culture of incredible hard work and pushing yourself to the next level. And that's just ingrained within that community. So that's a crucial reason why Israel has done well over the last 50 or so years. So then, what are the key ingredients for our revival? There's economics, there's politics, and there's culture. And in terms of, to be honest, each of these things needs work on them. There's no one size fits all. I'm not going to sit here and say I know the solution to all of our problems. We each need to pitch in and think about what there needs to be done in economics, in politics, in culture, and each of us can contribute to that. We genuinely can contribute something to that, and then we need to do our bit. But But in terms of what we think is probably the thing that moves the needle most, and this is this goes back to why I've gone full time on Islamic Finance Guru, and why we're kind of going after this mission, is we think that economics is the thing. Given my background from the corporate world and my interests, I'm interested. I'm sad enough as one of those people who looks at Excel spreadsheets and gets relatively happy, or if not happy, then at least not sad. I'm one of those kind of people, so I have interest in that area. We've been running Islamic Finance Guru for a number of years, so I've learned a lot about the industry. So for us, we thought, if we go on to the next slide, we thought the thing for us that moves the needle most is economics. Because if you can just raise the Muslim GDP by a few percentage points, if you can take the Muslim community from being amongst the poorest in the community to at least being on parity, if not becoming the more prosperous members of the community, then we deal with problems like underrepresentation in media, underrepresentation in politics, overrepresentation in prisons. We deal with all of those things. Health outcomes, where some of the most lowest life expectancy people in this country, but also globally, and we've got really bad health outcomes, education outcomes. There's a whole range of things that are connected with how prosperous we are financially as a community. So that's the thing that we think moves the needle the most, and that's really important, by the way. We don't want to just do something that is good, and none of us should try and do things that are just good. We should always question ourselves. There's an opportunity cost to what we're doing. If we decide to do something that we think is good, that means that we are not doing something else that may be better. And that's the thing that we need to strive for. We should be striving for stuff that is better. We need to be going for things that is the most efficient use of our time, that is the most effective use of our abilities and our resources and our networks and our situation. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He demands of us as well. We shouldn't, Inna Allah kataba al-ihsan ala kulli shay. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has written ihsan upon everything. And He says, even if you فَإِذَا ذَبَحْتُمْ فَأَحْسِنُوا الذِّبْحَ, that if you are doing sacrifice, if you're slaughtering an animal, then do that properly. You should make sure that the animal is calmed down. You should sharpen the knife. You should make everything perfect, even the little things. So if that's just slaughtering an animal, then what of our life plans? We should be not just doing things that are good, we should be striving for things that are the best. So how do Muslims actually get richer then? So we think that there are two key ways that Muslims can get richer. The first is by sorting out your personal finances, and the second is by creating the next big companies, so that inshallah in 20-30 years time we have at least 20-25% of the top 100 companies that are Muslim. That will be a game changer. So just thinking about personal finances now, if we carry on the slides, the first thing we need to do is we actually need to invest, right? And what I mean by that is Muslims are historically not very good, and it's not just Muslims, by the way, it's everyone, but particularly Muslims, are not very good at investing. We have lots of money that's kind of sat on the sidelines doing nothing. To give you a quite vivid example, you've got Costa Coffee or Starbucks coffee. If you take one of those coffees, let's say it's £3, and you add that up over the course of a week and then over the course of a month, it comes to about 90, 100 pounds. Now, let's say you invest that 90, 100 pounds every month instead of spending it on coffee, or just you invest 90, 100 pounds over 45 years, over a career from 20 to about 65, over 45 years. How much roughly do you think that cost of coffee would add up to? Straight on. What's that? No, it wouldn't add up to £1 million, but that's good. I mean, you see, cause and effect. He was thinking previously, I've told him that it was over £1 million, so he's straight in there. But no, this time it's under £1 million. It's 54,000. So that's how much the coffee itself would add up to. But if you had invested that in something quite middle of the road, any ideas how much that money the investment profit would have added up to in that 45 years? Any ideas?
1 trillion.
1 trillion, no. A little bit under that, a little bit under that.
200,000?
300,000.
200,000.
So the actual answer is 300,000. 354,000. And of course, if you can get something that yields a bit more, then you can make that go up to 500, 600, 700,000. That's crazy. That's just a cup of coffee a day that adds up to that amount of money if you are just consistent about it. You know, Warren Buffett, when you see his graph of his wealth, he's obviously one of the richer men in the world. You see his graph in the world, it starts off really, really flat. And then right at the end, in the last 5-10 years, it mushrooms to the multi-billions. And it does that. Any ideas what the secret is there? What's the secret there?
He's patient, like long-term investments. He doesn't want to like get rich overnight. It's more sort of a waiting game.
Absolutely, that's true. And one other thing.
Reinvesting continuously.
Exactly, reinvesting continuously and taking benefit from the effects of compounding. So, you know, when you talk about compounding interest, why does interest add up so quickly? Because the banks just keep on compounding it up. So if you owe them £100, but then you don't pay that, then they add on £20 interest, and then they will charge you interest on the £120 that you owe them, and suddenly that starts ballooning, you know, massively. And the same is the case with investments as well. So, you know, what I'm getting at here is that each of us have some savings, and I think it is our, you know, duty, our obligation to do good with that. It is our duty and obligation, as we've just discussed about, you know, where the Muslim position is in the world, to make sure that we are using that money effectively and investing it really well. And this is where we get onto, you know, how the 1% invests. So this is how we invest. We generally invest in stocks and bonds, and we keep a lot of money in cash. And then this is how the 1% invests. And then if we go on to if we compare the two between side to side, the key differences are the 1%, they invest a lot in real estate, but actually they invest a lot in private equity, so private companies, the kind of companies that I've been talking about, hedge funds, again, you know, trading in either private companies but also public companies as well, and a whole load of other things as well, so alternative assets. And so what are the kind of key differences that you see there? Obviously, you know, the big difference is in the asset classes. There's different asset classes in there, but also there's a diversity of asset classes. So the rich don't put their eggs in one basket. The rich also, if you notice, they don't keep as much in cash either. So they don't like to keep too much liquid because what's the problem with keeping stuff liquid in the long run?
It goes down in value.
It goes down in value because of inflation, right? So if inflation is at 2% and you just leave your cash in the bank, then over time that is literally just losing value. And if you have money that's been sat there for 2 years, you've actually become poorer as a result of that. So that's why it's not good to keep stuff in cash. And so this is what we do. With Islamic Finance Guru, the single thing that shapes all of our decisions, and Muhammad is my colleague number one. MashaAllah, he's an ex-founder. He's also not married, by the way. So if that's your inclination, then reach out to us afterwards. But Muhammad, he has joined us, and he will attest to the single thing that shapes all of our decision making is, does this thing that we are thinking about deciding on make Muslims richer? If the answer is yes, then we do that. If the answer is no, then we don't do that. That's the thing. And we don't obviously, we also make it in an efficient way. So with everything, there is an opportunity cost, of course. So we do things that we think are the most effective at making Muslims richer. And so we do basically two things. We've got an investment comparison that helps collate from all over the world the best investments, the most Sharia compliant investments that we found. So my background, as doing a master's in Islamic finance and studying with Sheikh Akram as part of my Alamiya degree is really helpful for this. And actually that's how Islamic Finance Guru started, because I was just writing for myself and I found that people were benefiting from it, and then it kind of mushroomed. And so each of these investments that we list out, we just want to make it easy for people to find it. be confident that they're Sharia compliant and to crack on and go for it. And we're genuinely not fussed who you go for, or even frankly if you go through us. I mean, I shouldn't say that, but genuinely I'm not fussed, because for us, long term, if Muslims are getting richer, that's the key thing. That's the thing that moves the needle. So that's the first thing. We help with general investments, but the other thing is we help with mortgage as well. And the reason why that's important, inshallah, we'll have a proper session on Islamic mortgages and all the pros and cons and debates on that in 2 weeks' time. But the reason why this stuff is so important is because it gets Muslims on the property ladder, and I could not stress how important that is. Because in 2008, when there was a global financial crisis, the Bank of England did something called quantitative easing, by which what happened essentially was they printed a whole load of money and they gave it to the banks to then do what they liked with it in order to kind of stimulate the economy. And all that happened was the banks, they gave it to people who are going to buy and sell property, so it hiked up property prices, and they gave it to investment banks, and so all of that money then went into public companies, the stock market. And since 2008 to very recently, the stock market and property prices have been an absolute drive. It's been a really strong bull market, and the people who had assets, the people who had stocks and shares, and the people who had property have done the best out of it. And many of you will know this, who've had property or who had some stocks and shares. You will have done well out of it. And it wasn't really because of any kind of trick. It was literally because when you have assets, they appreciate, and when you have cash, it doesn't. And particularly property is one of those assets that appreciates quite quickly, especially when government puts money into the economy. So that's why we want Muslims to get onto the housing ladder. So that's the first side, personal finance. Then the second side, and this is the exciting stuff. And also, by the way, this is as an investment class, this is not suitable for people, most people. It's only suitable for people who are fairly affluent or fairly sophisticated investors, so who've worked in this industry or who are obviously very rich. But this is important to talk about because there's a whole bunch of people, youngsters sat in front of me, but also there's a whole bunch of people who might own and run businesses. And the secret, the thing that we want to achieve here is to create Muslim businesses. I think it's about 16% of small businesses in London are Muslim owned. That's a chunky percentage, right? There's a lot of small Muslim businesses. But when you get to the city and you see the kind of clients that we work with at work, no Muslims whatsoever. There's a massive gap there. Something is going wrong between the small business level and the massive business level. And that's the thing that we want to bridge. And the ways that you bridge that are through networks and through capital, by giving venture capital, private equity capital, startup funding, all of that stuff. And then finally, by having people who have been there and done that. And alhamdulillah, I'm lucky in that we've got friends from university and others who have gone ahead and created massive companies. And the learning and the help that brings cannot be understated. And what we want to do now with Islamic Finance Guru is just help other founders, other startups who are just starting out on their journey to kind of tap into that learning and knowledge and be able to benefit from that. Because if we don't look after each other, then no one else will. And so over the last year or so, on this side of things, on the venture side, on the startup side, we've invested in 9 or 10 companies, Muslim founders, the majority of them, Sharia compliant businesses, of course. And we've invested around, I think it's 3 million now. I think it's 3 million. Some of the slides have said 2.5. And alhamdulillah, we've got 200 plus angels who invest alongside us. And these are quality businesses. This is not a charity, by the way. These are high quality businesses that are not available on the mainstream market. So as an example, we recently worked on a startup that we co-invested alongside the Twitter co-founder. We've invested alongside Serena and Venus Williams. We ended up with her Gmail account. And We've invested alongside the founders of MiniClip, you know, the gaming company. We're invested in the same companies that people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates are invested in. You know, I'm not just saying this, you know, to kind of, you know, show off or name drop. I'm saying this because it is possible and we can do this. And the Muslim community has now, you know, that access to be able to do that. We just now need to kind of take the right steps to be able to achieve that. And, you know, the final thing I would say, I mean, in terms of co-investors, there's a whole bunch of, like Y Combinator is probably the most prominent amongst that. They're the guys who invested in Airbnb and Dropbox and I think it's Box.com. Mohammed, any other names can you think of?
I mean, all the famous VCs.
Yeah, PayPal, and many, many others. So the point I'm making, particularly for, you know, the younger members of the audience, in terms of where you're thinking about your career and your, you know, your goals, obviously, firstly, think about what are you interested in, what are you good at, and then think about what there is a need for in the world, and see where there's an intersection of all those three things, and there you have a list of potential careers. But do give a lot of thought to things like artificial intelligence, to machine learning, to you know, future technologies like computer science degrees, maths, physics. All of this stuff is super, super crucial. Engineering is actually really, really valuable now as well, because I know I've spent like a decade cussing engineers because Muslims are engineers and accountants and lawyers, but actually engineering is now actually becoming quite valuable as well. So as you know, youngsters and people who have the potential to do something, have a think about that stuff, the things that are defensible, the things that need long-term investing without probably much return, but ultimately will bear fruit. Because, you know, what makes a company like Google or you know, something like that succeed so massively? The things that make them succeed is they have a moat around them. They have a really strong defense. You know, Google has a defense that, you know, their algorithms are just, you know, unmatched. No one gets as much traffic as Google. So Google's algorithms, in terms of, you know, being great at search, are just the best that they possibly can be. Google has a whole range of data as well, and then Google is, in a way, a sort of a marketplace. It's a platform where advertisers come, and then consumers come, and the more advertisers come, the more consumers come, and the more consumers come, the more advertisers come. So it's a virtuous cycle. And so Google has some really, really powerful defenses that mean that, you know, Joe Blogs can't get up tomorrow and start competing with Google in any effective way. So, and Google hasn't done that overnight. It's built up that defense. You know, it's taken a while, and they've you know, spent a lot in research and development and built that out. And there's been a whole lot of flops as well, right? And Google keeps on innovating, and the kind of things that they're innovating in these companies, we see this, right? Things like you know, automatically driven cars, things like voice activated technology, things like, you know, mind reading. So they're thinking about the future, and because they see that is where the next big thing is going to come out from. They're not trying to kind of, you know, if you had the average Muslim businessman who now kind of got into Google, he would probably liquidate the whole thing, put it into like London property and sit back and relax. But that's not the way to do it, because, you know, you become a non-entity after 10 years if you do that. And we've seen companies that have become non-entities as a result of them having done things like that. So there's that constant innovation, and for, you know, for youngsters and people who are thinking about their career, the thing I'm saying is really spend time on the hard stuff and become good at it, because what you're doing there is you're building up a defense, and that's what you need to be building up to have a successful company. So I mean, that's really it from my side. To kind of summarize then, you know, if you're interested, by the way, investing in startups, you can find out that on our website on the investment comparison page. And then finally, as a summary, high level, what we've talked about is Muslims are 20% poorer than the rest of the world. We need to do stuff to sort it out. There's a whole bunch of things that we can do. One of the key things we need to do is we need to get our economics sorted, and we need to become wealthier. And we think that there are two answers to do that. One is by sorting out your personal finances, and the other one is by helping Muslim entrepreneurs go from small businesses to the next big things. And if we achieve that, then I think we're really onto something. And my kind of parting words to you would be that you should not think. I know I have a tendency to chuck around the words technology and billion and these kind of Silicon Valley and these kind of buzzwords a lot, but put that all to one side. Ultimately this is a test that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. He does not give someone a burden that he cannot bear. Each of us have an A-star grade that we can achieve, and that's a miracle, isn't it? Like most exams that you sit, not everyone can achieve an A-star, but in the exam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, everyone can achieve an A-star. And ultimately, all we will be judged on is if we have really pushed ourselves, our wealth, our health, everything in the pursuit of that A-star grade. And that's all we can do. And I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes us from amongst those who do that. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم.